welcome back to The Independent Pianist. I'm your host, Cole Anderson. Let's get right into it. This is completing my series on Chopin's Opus 27 Nocturnes. I already made a video covering the C-sharp minor Nocturne Opus 27 number 1 a few weeks back, which you can find in the link that'll be in the corner of the video right about now. I feel that these two nocturnes happen to go together particularly well. Chopin wrote many sets of two nocturnes. In fact, all of the sets from Opus 27 on are grouped into groups of two, pairs of two, and they don't necessarily need to be performed that way, but this set in particular actually benefits from being performed that way. These two pieces really do go well together. They seem to kind of encapsulate two sides of the same emotional coin. Besides the fact that they're obviously in parallel keys, so C-sharp minor in the first one and D-flat major in the second one. So it's a darkness to light trajectory, if you will, but it's accomplished in a very different way from that kind of a key scheme in a Beethoven sonata or symphony, where it's much more triumphant. This is something quite different. This is a very enchanting nocturne. It's one of Chopin's most beguiling pieces, one of his most brilliant creations, one of the most ornate also amongst all of the nocturnes. It has this, it's very much like one of the later nocturnes in this kind of endless spinning out of melodic ornamentation. It's always becoming more and more complex and elaborate as the piece goes on, and it starts out pretty complex even from the beginning. This nocturne is one of several of the nocturnes that also exists in a veritable plethora of different versions. There's different versions that he left in copies for his students of many of these nocturnes with different ornaments and different expansions that are noted into the parts. And we can imagine that these various extensions originated from Chopin himself. So in the case of this nocturne, there are various copies of the French first edition that belong to his pupils, Camille Dubois, Jane Sterling, also his sister Ludwika, and there's another copy that belonged to a friend of his, Auguste Franchomme, who also supplied some variants which he claimed were Chopin's. Many of these changes are corroborated as well, so we can really tell that they were almost certainly from Chopin because we find the same changes in multiple copies from different students who were not necessarily familiar with each other. We're also very lucky to have an autograph for this nocturne. Chopin's autograph exists, and you can find it on IMSLP if you want to go and take a look at it. There are certain discrepancies between Chopin's autograph and the first editions, so you kind of have to use your wits to decide which of those are mistakes that were left out and which were things that Chopin revised going into the first edition. And there's no way to know for certain about all of them, although there's strong circumstantial evidence for certain of these changes. The edition that I'm using in this video is the copy of the French edition that was owned by Jane Sterling. I'm almost certain that's the one that is on IMSLP, which I used. And just for a little bit of background, Jane Sterling was the Scottish student that Chopin had toward the end of his life, and she was really the impetus behind Chopin's disastrous tour of England and Scotland in 1848, which no doubt hastened his end. It was a very physically difficult tour for the quite delicate Chopin. His health was very delicate by that time. No doubt she didn't intend it to be that. It was supposed to be an opening up for success for Chopin, but yes, he died not long after that. So that is that copy, I'm almost certain, and it has some of these variants as well as fingerings in Chopin's hand in it. So when it comes to all these variants and ornaments, I use almost all of them. In this particular nocturne, most of them originate from Franchomme's copy. They really are very excellent, though, very masterful. They don't disturb the underlying melodic structure. They're very tasteful, unobtrusive, and they also provide a pretty fascinating view into Chopin's ornamental sense. Chopin generally didn't like his works to be ornamented by the performer. In fact, he was kind of annoyed with Liszt for sometimes doing things like that. But it seems like he was not against tasteful ornamentation, particularly in pieces like the nocturnes, which are so reminiscent of Mozart on one hand, the late style of Mozart, and also the operatic style of someone like Bellini. And in both of those styles, there's a good deal of ornamentation, which is expected. The first such variant occurs in the very first bar of the piece. This is marked by a French homme to be played twice. I particularly like this variant because it immediately makes me think of another piece of Liszt's Constellation in D flat, which I also made a video about, by the way. That constellation, as I mentioned in the other video, is directly inspired by this nocturne, and it has a very similar opening. So as you hear, if you do play the first bar twice in the Chopin Nocturne, it makes the connection even more obvious between the two. So as in the first Nocturne from Opus 27, Chopin has left us with a strikingly flowing metronome marking. It's quite fast, 50 for the dotted quarter. And this speed can really work, although it is a bit awkward. You have to have a very well-developed technique to play the left hand smoothly at that speed. As in the first Nocturne, though, I would just say that it is not necessary to take these markings literally. There is an idea behind the metronome markings, which is more important than the literal speed. That is that we are supposed to feel these pieces in a big 2 beats per bar, instead of feeling 6 separate beats. If the speed is too slow, we'll start to feel this kind of 8th note by 8th note kind of pulse, and that's not what Chopin actually has in mind. He has something much more spun out and long, something with a longer line. And this, again, kind of connects to the operatic style, the kind of Bellini-esque style. If you have a flowing starting tempo, this allows substantial room for stretching and molding of this tempo as the melody becomes more and more ornate. And you can hear this in the performances of great operatic singers. They will do this during the course of an aria. If it starts at a certain tempo, they'll oftentimes take enormous room, and it just feels right because they need that space to really express all the ornamentation. So I do recommend trying to feel this flowing, kind of rolling forward feeling to the opening. Try practicing at 50 a little bit, and then you can still let it slow down just a little bit from there and still get that feeling of a big 2. The melody is very simple and direct right at the opening. Very quickly it becomes heavily ornamented. So the tempo is going to start stretching not too far after the opening. So as I was mentioning, the left hand is a little bit awkward, especially at a faster tempo, and there are some peculiar difficulties because the notes of the left hand are very widely spaced apart. And Chopin intentionally spaces out the notes over the distance of a tenth usually to give the accompaniment more richness and more of an orchestral quality. And this also allows Chopin to kind of hide interior voices in the harmony in a way that's very audible because the voices are farther apart. It becomes very transparent. So from a technical standpoint, as it comes to fingering, my solution for the opening arpeggio is to play the second through the sixth notes of each beat in one hand position, and then I fall over my fifth finger to my fourth for the first D flat of each beat. And I think this gives it a very floating feel. Your hand will feel very light once you get used to this fingering. I'm not really doing a legato from the fifth finger to the fourth finger. I'm just kind of floating over there. And the fingering you use exactly can change. In some places it's more comfortable to stretch over the whole tenth, especially if you have a larger hand. In some places you might want to use this more kind of flowing fingering. Now the structure of this nocturne is a kind of variation form, a little bit like a double variation or double variation / fantasy. There are two parts to the theme, the main theme. Usually they're referred to as strophes. So there's a first strophe for a solo voice, that's in D flat, which we just heard, and then there's a second strophe in a contrasting key. And the modulation always changes when Chopin is going to the second strophe. It's always a little different how he gets into it. We basically hear this two-strophe structure 3 times. So you could think of it as kind of being a theme plus 2 variations, maybe. Let's hear a little bit of the second strophe, since we already heard the first strophe. The first time we hear it, it starts in B flat minor, and then it modulates to E flat minor. So this is the point where we get something really like a love duet from an opera, and it's so beautiful, so intricate as well. The second strophe is always followed by a free continuation, or you could call it a transition, which is also different each time. So all 3 times it's a little different how this continues on. As you can hear, though, the music is already quite elaborately ornamented. It's almost like this is already a variation on a much simpler background structural melody. So if we reduced it down, it might come out sounding something like this. And of course, that completely eliminates most of the magic. So we're very lucky that Chopin decided to do this fully ornamented version, because that's just magical. You might also notice that I interpret most of the small notes here. There's a lot of little small grace notes, as they're called, that Chopin has written in. I interpret them as being on the beat most of the time, which is different than maybe the majority of people used to play them. Maybe nowadays it's different. We have a lot of testimony that Chopin's usual intention for these grace notes 9 times out of 10 was to play them on the beat. In many of Chopin's pupils' copies, he's marked little lines connecting these notes to the bass notes that are on the beat. And this is very much in the style of the 18th century, 17th and 18th century. In particular, in C.P. Bach, in his treatise on keyboard playing, which was an inspiration for Mozart and Beethoven and many others, he talks about this more German performance tradition of playing small notes on the beat. So ironically, the small notes were more important. They become more important and more kind of emphasized because they're played on the beat. They take their value away from the written note, the large note after them. It does lend a very expressive quality to these ornaments, which I think you don't get if you play the small notes, if you sneak them in before the beat. There's a much smoother or slicker kind of sound that you get then. Everything kind of feels like it fits in a bit more mechanically. And there's many great performers, of course. Arthur Rubinstein would be a great example, who generally played the small notes before the beat, and they made it sound really good. But there is kind of a unique feeling that you get if you can do it on the beat. It's a subtlety, but it's definitely striking. So let's hear a quick comparison. Here's how it would sound with the ornaments in this passage before the beat. And now to contrast with that, with the ornaments on the beat. If you look through the notation, you can see that Chopin's kind of marked some of the on-the-beat ornaments in larger notes, so he was a little inconsistent about how he marked this. But I think that's further corroboration, if any was needed, that that's really what he was going for. I wanted to talk about another little detail of ornamentation, because this is also a performance difficulty. Chopin writes this intricate little passage. So the first time he writes this, it's with a third, right, a C and an E flat, as a 32nd note, followed by the same third as a 16th note, and in the autograph he has a tie on the lower C, so you hold the C over, and then there's a little small note in between, an F small note. In the later 2 places, which are also in different keys, he writes the same rhythmic pattern, but with a trill on the 2nd chord. And so you could choose to perform these things differently, maybe to repeat the chord and add a trill on the 2nd note. I really think that Chopin probably intended these to be analogous passages, though, and that the second way he notated it is just a shorthand. I think that the tie on the lower note is probably supposed to be understood as being in the later examples. Chopin might have just forgot to put it in. I think he's showing us a short trill which starts a little bit before the beat. So it's a very elaborate way of notating that, but Chopin may have felt he needed that because, again, using this tradition that Chopin grew up with and was used to of ornaments being on the beat, again, going back to C.P. Bach, Chopin would have expected trills to be on the beat. And so he may have needed this notation to show us that he was doing something against the rules, having a trill that started a little bit early. I think it works really well. It's a subtle effect. It does greatly simplify the execution, and it renders the passage a little smoother and more elegant, I think, in sound. Continuing into this transition section immediately following the second strophe, we get one of the first examples of some extra ornamentation in Franchome's copy of this nocturne, probably originating from Chopin. So Chopin adds this chromatic scale that we just heard there on the second one. We suppose it's Chopin. I really like this one also. It makes a lot of sense. I mean, Chopin ornaments the octaves, the falling octaves, into those 32nd note patterns, so why not also ornament the reply? It makes perfect sense. Just something that maybe Chopin hadn't thought of by the time of publication, but he came up with it later. After this, there's some very intricate voice leading in the left hand, which Chopin specifically notates some inner parts in the harmony that he wants the performer to point out, so they're marked with the 8th note stems. It's also possible here that we should continue to bring this voice out in the left hand as the passage goes on. So I've kind of marked those notes in, you can see. I've done that in my recording, as you just heard, without hitting you over the head with it. I've tried to bring them out. You could even make it more obvious. In a big hall, for instance, it might make sense to do that. Okay, so now we're at the first variation of the first strophe, and Chopin, in the copies of his pupils, he's added a pianissimo here, which was not in the first editions. He also continues to expand the intricacies of the voice leading in the left hand, and we get some more beautiful operatic variants from Franchome's copy of the score, which are very, again, Bellini-esque. So at this point, we get a magical transformation going to the second strophe. Chopin takes in this context, the most surprising type of harmonic move. Instead of going to a minor key, he goes to a major key and also a third related. And we're really not expecting it, I think, at this point. So the effect is just beautiful. Even though a third relation would have been normal, I suppose, for a romantic composer. It really works here. I always think this is kind of amazing because in this passage, it's almost physically as if you can hear the change from flats to sharps. It really feels like everything becomes lighter and filled with this kind of inner radiance or something, and it's really magical. So in the continuation passage after the second strophe, we get a big climax. And there's another important textual change here that I wanted to bring up. In the first edition, Chopin has a diminuendo at this climax. We can assume it's maybe a diminuendo to mezzo forte or something like that, and then there's a forte written later. And this entire passage is written to be played quite strongly, including all the fioritura, all the kind of coloratura ornamentation at the end of this passage, a famously tricky little passage. But this is a place where Chopin evidently had a major change of heart. In all of his students' all of the additions from his students of this piece with his markings in it, he's replaced this. He's crossed out the diminuendo, he's put in a crescendo to either fortissimo or even fortississimo, like a triple forte. So this got into many editions, modern editions as well, because all the first editions and the autograph and everything use a diminuendo. It's only in all of his, the copies belonging to his students that we get this change. I think it's really powerful though. So here's what it sounds like with the big crescendo. In this case, I can say unequivocally there's no doubt that this is a change that Chopin would have wanted. If he'd done another edition, he probably would have changed this. There's so much corroboration for it. I guess the question is, what is the idea here? How do you interpret a triple forte at this point? It's a very lyrical piece, that could maybe encourage you to be kind of harsh. How does that fit? And I think, again, it's essential just to use your imagination. I think Chopin doesn't mean triple forte in the sense of breaking strings. You have to imagine the way a soprano sounds, a really big soprano. If maybe you like Birgit Nilsson or Renee Fleming or Montserrat Caballé or someone like that. Someone with a really huge voice. And if you think of how they sound when they're in their biggest moments and they're kind of riding the waves of a really rich orchestral accompaniment with their full bloom and richness of tone, that's what Chopin's going for here. It should be a really round and warm kind of sound. No harshness, no forcing. So keep your arms relaxed, kind of loosely drop your weight in order to make this sound, and that should get the right effect. Mentioned, originally this whole passage was supposed to be relatively strong. He hadn't written it as being fortissimo before, but there was a forte marking later on here by the C flat, and there wasn't really anything after that. He even had this indication con forza later in the original editions. Again, later all crossed out, and Chopin plans this diminuendo to pianissimo for all this ornamentation in the higher registers. And this is really great. I mean, this is Chopin. It's not just because it's an interesting dynamic. This is Chopin really planning the structure out, getting a better contrast between the different reappearances of this theme. It creates a long, overarching structural form. So we get kind of a normal first time we hear the first strophe. The second time is very, very soft and moonlit. And then the third time starts out with this magnificent, full, rich tone, which then dies away to almost nothing, and we get this incredibly elaborate ornamentation. It's really much more of a journey that way if you really have this contrast between all of the first strophe appearances. Okay, let's hear a little bit of the second half of this first strophe in this variation, and hear this wonderful coloratura ornamentation. Listening closely, you may have noticed that I made a slight alteration in this passage, which is a little bit daring maybe, but I thought it was justified. The highest note in this passage is an F4, and on many pianos in Chopin's day, this was the highest note. The Erards of the time maxed out there, I think most of them, as did most uprights. Chopin may have had a Pleyel that went up to a G. I wasn't able to really ascertain. He did by 1840 or so, but I'm not sure if he had one at the time of writing this Nocturne. But still, he didn't have the high A flat, and that's what he would have needed, I think, to write this final arpeggio the way he would have wanted to. The final arpeggio is a dominant seventh arpeggio, A flat, F, D flat, C flat, but he had to kind of squish the notes together in the higher register to make that top octave fit, because he didn't have the A flat on top. So he had to write a scale for the first 4 notes. So it's debatable here if you should really make a change. Should you change it to the way Chopin would have written it if he'd had the extra octave, or should you use the solution that he came up with because it provides more variety? So it's up to you. I made the choice to change it to the higher octave. I think it's really striking that way, especially on a very resonant modern piano. Also, just from a technical perspective, to mention this passage probably seems at first glance very complicated, especially because you have to coordinate with your left hand. And how do you line up your left hand and right hand over this incredibly long space of time? In actual fact, Chopin has already done the work for us, though. He carefully planned out this figuration so that it would contain exactly 48 notes, which evenly divides with the left hand. So you get 4 right hand notes for every left hand note. And it's really childishly simple. It's not obvious to the listener that you're doing this, especially if you play the left hand very softly, as you should. But it's very easy to line up. It just kind of works like clockwork. Also, as far as the interpretation, I strongly recommend not rushing through this passage. That also, if you stretch this part out a little bit, it not only makes it easier to play, but it also gives this very vocal coloratura soprano kind of sound to all this stuff. And there's no way a soprano could really do this at the speed that a pianist can play it. And even at a slower speed, it's faster than really any human voice could interpret it. But I think we want to at least suggest a little bit of something vocal here, even though it's so fast. And I think that's also corroborated by Chopin himself. In the very next passage, when we get the second strophe for the last time, he marks con anima, with animation. So that gives the idea that he was expecting we probably would spread the tempo out in the previous section. So there's one more very slight change I'll just mention in the various copies from his pupils. You can see that Chopin added 8s under these bass notes, so he was expanding them to octaves. We assume this is a change from Chopin. It's in more than one copy. I decided not to make this change. I thought it took away from the arrival on the A flat, the low A flat bass note here. But it would be perfectly reasonable to do it. Maybe I'll change my mind at some point. And now we're at the coda, which is the most extraordinary passage in this piece, which is probably the most extraordinary piece of this period in Chopin's life. First, we hear this series of diminished 7th chords, parallel diminished 7th chords, with the dissonant interval of the tritone emphasized in the right hand, but at a very soft dynamic, so it doesn't sound harsh at all. When he repeats this passage, we get a kind of bell effect. It's very magical tone painting. High up in the upper range, he adds this grace note covering the interval of a 10th. A very haunting, unforgettable effect. This is one of those few cases where Chopin may have meant the grace note also to be before the beat. I think here it doesn't really make sense to try to do it on the beat. We get a really operatic passage par excellence. We get a duet, this really melting duet to finish this coda. The two voices echo each other and intertwine in this really wonderful way. And notice Chopin's markings here. I think it's very important. Start this passage, I think, in the main tempo. Don't go too slowly, because Chopin marks collando during the first iteration of this passage. So collando is kind of gently reducing speed and volume. And then smorzando toward the end of the second iteration. So smorzando dying away, getting even slower and softer. So you need to leave a lot of room to slow down as this passage ends. It's like everything is just falling asleep and disappearing. There's one more final difficulty which needs to sound really easy in the final 3 bars. Chopin writes groups of 7 against 6, right hand to left hand. And this can seem impossible at first. You know, how do you mathematically divide the notes, do this polyrhythm so that it actually sounds right? 2 things here. One is that just keep in mind it doesn't have to be mathematically exactly correct. It should have kind of a free improvised sound. However, figuring out how to actually space the notes against each other is not as hard as it might seem. And if you think about it for a minute, you'll see why this is. So a group of 7 is just slightly faster than a group of 6. So the second group of 7, the second note of the group of 7 in the right hand, after the downbeat, which is together, of course, is going to be just a little bit faster, a little bit before the second note in the left hand. And after that, your hands don't line up at all until the next beat, until the next big beat. So all the notes of the group of 7 after the first one and all the notes of the group of 6 after the first one don't line up. They go, the right hand will always be going in between the left hand notes. Since the right hand's a little bit faster, the degree to which it'll be spaced from the following left hand note is they're gonna get a little closer together every single time. So that's really all you have to do. You just practice in that way, spacing them in between each other and maybe making the distance come closer together as you go towards the end of the beat. But it should be kind of free and improvised. I think if you just practice it with this in mind a few times, you'll figure out a solution that'll sound right. So my last piece of advice on this wonderful nocturne, use Chopin's pedaling in these last few bars. In all the first editions, Chopin marks 1 pedal with no release for the last 3 bars. Most people change the pedal when they reach the high note there, the ending of the 7 against 6 passage. So when they have the bass note, they change the pedal, which I think just brings everything right down to earth, kind of normalizes everything, and makes it way less interesting and way less magical. So I would just hold the pedal all the way through the end until you're done. And it really works. It will really work. It's one of those things that is not obvious because we're taught to pedal kind of cleanly, but Chopin's music is full of these kind of blurred effects where the harmonies mix together beautifully. It's all one harmony, but you just have to keep in mind that you can do this. You can actually hold this pedal out. And it works on a modern piano just as well as on one of Chopin's pianos. In fact, in the autograph, Chopin marks 1 pedal for the last 4 bars. He doesn't even put the pedal change where the 7 groups of 7 start. I like that even better myself. So you can decide which way you want to do it, but they both really, really work. All right, well, thank you very much. This was fun to talk about this piece. It's one of my favorite Chopin pieces. I hope it'll become one of your favorites if you don't already know it. And it just remains for me to thank all of my viewers out there, especially my wonderful Patreon supporters who help me bring you this content every week. You can sign up to make pledges, by the way, on Patreon if you like at www.patreon.com/independentpianist. Otherwise, just stay tuned next week. I'll have more music and conversation for you. So here's the complete performance of that Chopin Nocturne coming up in just a few seconds. Thanks, and keep practicing out there.